Our very special guest is Councilman Gregory Johnson. His district is the West Village, Hell's Kitchen, Upper West Side, and Chelsea.
Yep.
And you got, excuse me, Flatiron, Soho, the cool part of town.
It's a cool part of town.
You come from a union household.
Yes.
Your father was a Teamster.
Yes.
Tell us about your father, your upbringing.
So I am not a native New Yorker. I grew up in a little tiny town about 25 miles north of Boston. My dad, who, God rest his soul, passed away 3 years ago. He was a Teamster. He was a Pepsi truck driver. He was a very proud union member. My mom was my lunch lady at school, and I grew up in this little tiny town, which was fairly affluent. There were 12 units of public subsidized housing, and my family lived in one of those 12 units in that town. And so for me, part of the reason why we were able to be in a nice community was because of public housing. And for me, part of the reason why we were able to have good health insurance and benefits was because of my father's union. So it was impactful and meaningful on my childhood and adolescence, and I'm really proud that my father was a Teamster.
Did you grow up with the Wahlbergs?
No, not too far.
Not too far, yeah.
They were, from Dorchester, as people from Boston would say. And I grew up in a little tiny town called Middleton, which is near Salem, Massachusetts. You want to talk about wild Halloween. The wildest place in the country is Salem, home of the witches. So that's where I grew up.
Yeah, I maybe some people will be visiting you from Salem on Halloween at the Village.
Exactly.
Tell us a little bit about your history in public service prior to being elected as a city council. I understand you were the youngest person ever to serve as chair of the New York City Community Board.
Well, yeah, I was. I moved to New York when I was 18 years old, and I moved to Chelsea. I still live in Chelsea. I've been in Chelsea for nearly 14 years. And when I moved to the community, I got involved in local democratic politics, but I also got involved in community activism and local community issues. And the most grassroots level of city government, for folks that don't know, are our local community boards. There are 59 community boards in New York City. The community board that I was appointed to when I was 23 years old was Community Board 4, which covered Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen. And I served on that community board for 8.5 years. And eventually, 6 years in, I became chair of the community board. And at the time, I was the youngest community board chair in the city. I definitely was not the youngest ever. I think former council member Lou Fidler from Brooklyn, I think he was elected chair of his community board in Brooklyn at the age of 21 or something like that. So that is what really gave me some experience in working on local issues that mattered in the community, and it's what got me interested in running for city council.
What are some of the issues facing your district?
Well, as you said, Greg, my district is fairly geographically large. It covers the neighborhoods of West Soho, Hudson Square, Greenwich Village, the West Village, Chelsea, Flatiron, Hell's Kitchen, a little bit of the Upper West Side, Columbus Circle, Times Square, the Theater District, the Garment District, the High Line, Hudson Yards, the New Whitney Museum, Madison Square Garden, Penn Station. I could go on. I tell you all of that because each one of us in the council have 170,000 constituents, split equally. But if you look at the daily population of my district, because of Times Square and all of the commercial office space and the High Line and the Whitney Museum, my daily population goes up to about 1.5 million people because of what's going on there.
Yeah.
And so we face, of course, hyper-local issues that matter, schools, parks, transportation issues, affordable housing, but also Times Square is the crossroads of the world. Columbus Circle has been revitalized. Hudson Yards is rising from the former dilapidated Far West Side. So it is a district that has seen a rapid and enormous amount of change over the past 10 years.
As head of the City Council's Health Committee, tell us about some of the issues that you are addressing there.
So When I was elected to the council, and then after the speaker's race was settled about a month in, I asked the Speaker Mark Viverito, that I be appointed chair of the Health Committee, and I'm very grateful that she appointed me chair of that committee. Part of the reason why I wanted to chair the committee, I'm not a doctor, I didn't go to medical school, I don't have direct medical experience, but I believe I'm the only openly HIV positive elected official in New York City, and I think in the entire state of New York. And because of my experience for 11 years dealing with a chronic medical condition, having health insurance, not having health insurance, being able to afford my COBRA, not being able to afford COBRA, qualifying for the AIDS Drugs Assistance Program, not qualifying for it. I thought that I was in a unique position to advocate on behalf of New Yorkers who face similar circumstances. So what I have done, and I have a very close working relationship with Commissioner Bassett, the head of the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene here in New York City, is to fight on behalf of New Yorkers who really have been left behind. We see across New York City major health disparities. Your zip code in New York City is a more likely predictor of your long-term health and what age you will die, your zip code, than your genetic code. If you live on the Upper East Side below 96th Street, you are likely to live, I believe, 11 more years than if you live in East Harlem 20 blocks away.
It's amazing.
Why is that? That is because when you look at communities of color, when you look at places where there has been endemic poverty for years, when you look at places that don't have primary care physicians, pediatricians, preventative care, when you look at those places, you see that people are not getting the services they need. So I am very much aligned with Commissioner Bassett and with the de Blasio administration in really trying to look at the issues that are affecting communities and where you have groups who are not being treated fairly and are suffering poor health outcomes and consequences because of that.
You're listening to Reaching Out. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237 Teamsters. Our very special guest is Councilman Corey Johnson. Local 237 has 1/3 of its membership that works for the New York City Housing Authority. You have a lot of housing developments, public housing, and you said you lived in public housing in Massachusetts. You have a lot of public housing in your district. Can you tell us what those developments are,
Yes.
where they are, and also your thoughts on the developments of public housing these days?
Yes. So in that large district that I described to you, in Chelsea, there are two large and wonderful public housing developments. One is called the Robert Fulton Houses,
Yes.
which is between 9th and 10th Avenues from 17th Street up to 19th Street. And the other is the Elliott Chelsea Houses, which is just north of London Terrace, 25th Street, between 9th and 10th Avenues as well. They were, as a lot of public housing was, not all, they were built in the 1950s for veterans who were coming home from the war. And Chelsea used to be, many decades ago, the waterfront was where a lot of work got done. Shipping was done, importing, exporting. There was a lot of things that happened on the far west side on the Hudson River. And so the neighborhood, there were Irish longshoremen who lived in the neighborhood. And eventually, Chelsea became more diverse. You had a larger Puerto Rican community that moved in. In the 1990s, it became more of a LGBT community, a gay community. But the public housing developments have remained there, and they've been a place where an economically diverse set of people could actually live in Chelsea. Now, what I hear all the time from my constituents who live in those two housing developments is they always say to me, when are they taking our buildings away?
Yeah.
There's a fear out there
Yes.
because you've seen these neighborhoods change so dramatically with luxury condominiums, with high-end retail, with all of these things happening. People who have lived in the neighborhood for 20, 25, 30, 35 years, who raised their kids here, who sent their kids to school here, who are involved in the local PTA or the block association, are afraid they're going to get driven out. And this is what we're seeing all over New York City, not just in my neighborhood. We're seeing it in Brooklyn. We're seeing it in certain places of Queens.
It's already happening.
It's happening.
Yeah.
It's gentrification.
Yes.
It's happening. And so what we need to do is we need to ensure that people who live in NYCHA developments are not treated different than other folks in New York City. What do I mean by that? We see instances all the time, and I'm sure your members have to deal with this. The city council had a hearing, I believe about 3 weeks ago, about a development in the Bronx where I guess there was a leaking roof for 6 to 8 months.
Yes.
Destroying people's apartments, creating mold, unsafe, unsanitary conditions for children, seniors, and frankly, anyone. And so I have similar issues at my developments, even in the middle of Chelsea, where you have leaking roofs, you have broken down elevators, you have garbage strewn throughout the stairwells that are not taken care of. You have things that it's not actually the workers' fault who work in the buildings, and it's not entirely the residents' fault either. Some of this is neglect that has happened for far too long without investment. NYCHA for many, many, many years, as you know, Greg, really counted on the federal government being a big supporter. And the federal government over the last decade has really sort of divested from public housing all across the country.
Yeah.
And so Mayor de Blasio has come up with a plan called Next Generation NYCHA, which is to try to right the ship and get NYCHA's financing in order so that we can preserve public housing for the people who need it most.
Yeah, I won't talk about Next Generation NYCHA. I give you an hour on that one, but we're going to go through that. But I will say that the Pataki administration, Governor Pataki for 12 years, and the Giuliani administration both divested from NYCHA. And their divestment cost NYCHA at least $1 billion in funding.
Horrific.
Because the state used to give $60 million every year for its developments, and the city would give $30 million. That was $90 million. You multiply that $90 million times 12. And actually it could have been 20 because Mayor Bloomberg didn't put it back either. You're talking about over $1 billion in funding just from that alone, more or less. And then what the federal government took, which could have been another $1 billion. So we're talking about $2 billion. So that's what we see in NYCHA.
Yeah, I mean it's a massive problem. I mean, the one thing the mayor said when he came into office was he wanted to ensure that New Yorkers who had been left behind and ignored for many, many years, basically almost 20 years in some instances, were actually going to feel like the city cared about them. And I know that the Next Generation NYCHA plan isn't perfect, but I do think that they are trying to do the right thing. It's going to take a long way to go. I want to tell you that my colleague, Richie Torres, who chairs the Public Housing Committee in the council,
Yes.
has been like a hawk.
Yes.
He has been
Yes.
all over this.
Yes.
Oversight hearings, legislation. He is born and raised in public housing. His mother, I believe, still lives in public housing in the Bronx. And so we have him who is really out there fighting on behalf of NYCHA residents.
And I could tell you from the union standpoint, and I'm going to another meeting today with some housing residents, we have several ideas that have not even been tapped into that we can present that can help NYCHA run its developments properly, save money. We have a lot of ideas. We just ask for a seat at the table. But if we don't get a seat at the table, we're going to make a seat at the table.
Well, that should you should have a seat at the table.
I know, but
That's not happening?
They've been reluctant. You know, it's like we're going to tell you what we need from you. You're going to do it. That's not how it's going to work.
That's not the way to work.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for reaching out. This has been a very fruitful discussion. I'm Gregory Floyd, President Local 237. Our very special guest was Corey Johnson, Councilman, City Councilman. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Pleasure.